Our speaker tonight, who has just returned from a trip to the Middle East, albeit on vacation this time, mostly I hope, Daniel Brubaker is primarily a scholar of Quran manuscripts of the 7th to 10th centuries, the earliest period of the book's existence. He defended his doctoral dissertation titled Intentional Changes in the Quran Manuscripts and was awarded his PhD at Rice University in Houston in 2014. Since then, he's continued his work researching corrections in early Qurans. And to date, Dr. Brubaker has analyzed approximately 10,000 early Quranic manuscripts, or manuscript folios in institutions and libraries throughout Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere, Doha, Kuwait, Tashkent. Obviously, the work with manuscript research is full of theological and historical implications, and I hope someday we can get Dr. Brubaker back to address that subject, which is not the one tonight. He believes it's important to understand that not all ideas are equal. All people are equal, but their ideas are not equal. And that Americans, as Americans, we need to think carefully about the heritage we have in our system of limited government. Affirmation of certain rights is given by God. The embrace of the Bill of Rights, including freedom of speech, press, exercise, and religion. How we navigate our encounters as a nation with a system of belief that sees some of these things as illegitimate is the question Dr. Brubaker will address tonight. I'll also just point out that his Quranic manuscript research is forthcoming in print in the form of an academic monograph as well as 2 books designed for a more general audience. That would be most of us. Much of it is also becoming available through Quran Gateway, an online research tool for academics. He's a member of the Islamic Manuscript Association, the Association for the Study of Middle East and Africa, and the International Quranic Studies Association. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brubaker in his address on how some Muslim activists are using speech codes to subjugate the West and how to respond.
Thanks, Bob, for that kind introduction and for the invitation to be here. It's great to be back. I've been here only a couple times, and the last time I was here, Claire Lopez was up, and it was a wonderful, wonderful presentation. So it's a real honor to be here. I know that this podium sees a lot of really important people, so it's really nice to be up here, and I hope it will be of some benefit to you tonight. Well, I just want to spend a moment to go through a little bit more of background. I know that even though it's not the topic for tonight, I'll tell you a little bit of what I've done and where I've been to fill in a little bit of why it is that I'm interested in this topic that I've chosen for the evening. So I did my research for my PhD at Rice University. I spent 8 years there, and I'm thankful for the 8-year cutoff because I might still be working on it if that were not the case. So I began at Rice. I had a couple questions already tonight about how I learned Arabic. I began learning Arabic in Seattle at a language academy, and then applied to work at Rice University and learned the rest under David Cook, my advisor, sitting one-on-one with him in his office. It was wonderful to do that. And along the way, obviously I had a lot of basic, I should see the clock, okay. A lot of basic background in religious studies. It was in the religious studies department, and also some more focused work in Islam, not specifically on the Quran and Quran manuscripts, so foundations, the classical texts of Islam, the Arabic, of course, Islamic culture and history and so forth. So I do have that background, although it wasn't my narrow focus when I decided to drill down. Along the way, I was shown some pictures of manuscripts by a colleague, Dr. Keith Small, now Dr. Keith Small. He was still working on his doctorate at the time. And one photograph that he showed me really stood out to me, and it was a photograph of a Quran manuscript that had nearly an entire line, I think. Actually, there were two photographs. One had a line, one had about a line and a half erased and overwritten on it. And I thought, wow, that is really something else. I didn't expect to see something like that in an early Quran manuscript. So to make a long story short, when it came time to choose my actual topic for my dissertation, I contacted Keith back and said, do you think that there would be enough in this to do a doctoral dissertation entirely on corrections in Quran manuscripts? And he said he thought that there was, and I made that decision and sure hoped that there would be enough for me to write a dissertation on. As it turned out, I wound up looking at about 3,000 pages of early Quran manuscripts, traveling around and seeing them, many of them in person, in the next couple of years, and found enough corrections to justify a dissertation. So that was about 800 corrections there. So I found it very interesting. It was sort of touching on what we're going to be talking about this evening. It was kind of a striking moment to me when I first had access to look at these manuscripts in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. I spent the entire day amazed that they had actually put this 1,300, 1,400-year-old manuscript in front of me and let me flip through it, spend the entire day looking through it, very important early Quran manuscript. And then leaving the library that evening and going and getting on the train in Paris and seeing these folks with the full fully covered, and a couple of young Muslim guys, sitting across from me on the train, and realizing, number one, they have no idea what I've been spending my day doing, but number two, realizing that the effect of these ideas, it's not just a sterile pursuit. The effects of these ideas that was in these documents are still being felt in the world today, in individual people's lives, and in the impact that those lives are having on others around them. So yeah, that's just by way of a little bit further introduction. As Bob mentioned, I just got back from Israel and trip to Israel, and we stopped along the way because Aeroflot tickets were the cheapest ones. We went that way, and my wife thought it would be great to go and tour Moscow on the way, since we had a 12-hour layover, so we did that. So in 2 weeks, past couple weeks, I've been through Moscow, Red Square, the Kremlin, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, all the Nazareth, south to Eilat, and up to the Golan Heights. And Golan Heights, I'll mention that again in a second.
Washington, D.C.?
And Washington, D.C., been back over here. And so it's been a whirlwind couple of weeks. We were up in the Golan Heights when we first pulled up there. So my wife asked me, are you taking us to a safe place? You're not going to take me and the kids to a place that's dangerous. I said, no, Israel's fine. It's all what's in the news is worse than what's actually there. Well, we pull up into the Golan Heights, and as it winds up, we're staying in a cabin on a kibbutz that's 2.5 miles from the border. And as we're coming up into the area, we see the smoke rising. And as you know, it's been in the news lately. The IDF was gathered up there, and the Syrians were making incursions, up into the buffer zone there. So it's very strange to be introduced, to be shown your room by when you check into a hotel and have them say to you, well, there's the bathroom and there's the kitchen, and if the air raid alarms go off, get on the floor. But we made it through, and my wife was very calm on that. But again, I tell you that also to emphasize that ideas have impact on, we're just surrounded all over the world and in our daily lives with the fact that these things that we believe have impact not only on us, but people around us. Sometimes people have ideas that are, or notions that are true. Sometimes they have them that are false. Sometimes they have them that they misinterpret. Sometimes they're very old, stretching back thousands of years. Sometimes they're just the trend of the day. And we're dealing with all these things kind of mashed together. And it's one of the wonderful things actually about our country, that we can have that sort of environment where we can so freely interact with all these different things, but they're not without their impact in the world for us and for people around us. So I hope this talk isn't disappointing to you. I feel like there are a lot of really sophisticated people in the room who have read a lot of sources and widely in this area, so I'm going to try and give some broad. It's actually not going to be that difficult to get, because I think most people, from even talking to you at the beginning, these are things that you've thought about a lot, and I think that many of us as Americans have thought about a lot in recent years as we see what's going on around us regarding free speech and where do these boundaries lie with these things. But the talk is concerned with basic elements of humanity that we as Americans consider to be God-given rights and heritage of all people. All people, not only us, but the right to think and speak one's mind freely, and even if this causes discomfort to other people. The United States is a nation that protects liberty, and sometimes we conflate that with freedom. They're not exactly the same thing, but liberty as a just and moral precondition for human flourishing and the opportunity to pursue and encounter truth. Truth. Okay, so we do have that idea of truth, which I'm going to come back to in a second. We're the only nation in the history of the world, as far as I know, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, to be founded on the principle, the biblical principle, by the way, that all people are created equal. And I say the word people there because I believe that is what is intended. Anybody know why I think that's what was intended in the Declaration of Independence? All people, regardless of race or gender. I'll be interactive tonight too, by the way, so I just want you not to fall asleep. So.
No, men was understood to mean humankind.
Right. It was used very often generically in that sense. So that was certainly one of the possible meanings at the time, which I think is entirely true, and it's reasonable to read it that way. Anything else? Any other ideas about that?
I'm not sure that they meant that American Indians.
Yeah.
It's very doubtful to me that they included American Indians and not white people.
Okay, so I think you might be. I think you might be. And the comment was that there is questionable whether American Indians or Native peoples were considered to be included in that. And I think it may have been the case with some of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence that they would have felt that way. The reason that I think that it included, that I believe strongly that it included all people, is where it came from. So, what's the word that comes right before that? Created. All men are created equal. Okay? So where's the first mention that, what's that referring back to? Well, it's clearly referring back to Genesis 1:27, which says, in the image of God, he created them. He created him, male and female, he created them. So this is the account of creation, and when we encounter that phrase in the Declaration of Independence, I think that that's what it means clearly, because that's the source of the creation account to which they're referring when they meant all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator, in my opinion. But I think that's a pretty solid argument in my view. So, and we took some time to live up to that, obviously, as a nation. Okay, so as I mentioned, it's fairly simple what we're talking about, and I'll jump into it in a second. But, it's really important that we reconnect with this idea of liberty in our country, and I think you probably feel that as well, particularly with the young generation. There was a poll recently that you may be aware of that 40% of millennials, I believe it's 18 to 34, is the millennial category there too. A Pew Research poll that said 40% of them felt that it was appropriate for government to place limitations on certain types of offensive speech. That's a huge shift, and that's a huge cultural shift. Where is this coming from? Well, it's coming from a number of different directions, but partly I think it's coming from what we're going to be talking about here. Freedom of speech and the right not to be offended. I think, and this is what the right not to be offended. Yeah, they're two different things. No, I'm not putting them together. I'm putting them on opposite sides here. The right not to be offended, which a lot of young people feel that there is this right not to be offended, and many Muslims actually. Not all Muslims, by the way. So I want to make that clear tonight too. That there's a right not to be offended, but I just want to make the statement that these two are mutually exclusive. You can have one or you can have the other, but you cannot have them both at the same. You have to pick one or the other. With freedom of speech, truth can be existing alongside a lot of untruth or other, competing ideas, but at least it can be out there. In contrast, a society that elevates the right not to be offended merely perpetrates a world of comfortable ignorance and feelings of victimhood. And I think the former society is the better place to live. Now, I think we're all sympathetic to the hurts of insults. I'm really, I get moved with compassion when somebody is hurt, and I think most of us do. But I've come to realize the necessity of facing truth and possible offense in order to maintain liberty and its wonderful benefits, because liberty and truth are great benefits, and you can miss out on them if you start to go down this road of limitation. So, all right. So what we're talking about now is the dynamics of a civilizational struggle, which I think is a civilizational struggle involving patterns and contours in the actions and attitudes of many people who are acting rationally, actually, according to their own preset assumptions about the world, about what's true and about the way the world works, what is appropriate and inappropriate, and so forth. At one end of the struggle is the Western liberal tradition that lies at the base of the proposition liberty and justice for all. And, sorry, let me get my glasses out. I actually do need these at this age. Just cross that age where I need these. And at the other end of the struggle is the greatest, what I believe to be at least one of, but possibly the greatest colonizing civilization in the history of the world, Islam. Both of these traditions are rooted, interestingly, in the proposition of a transcendent personal reality, that is, God. Both of them are rooted in the proposition of God. The Western liberal tradition derives its worldview and non-negotiable propositions from the Bible. And even though a lot of our culture and society today doesn't operate with that, on that premise, we still have that as lying sort of at the root of what we are founded, the idea of unalienable rights and so forth. So when we say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, this is what we're appealing to, that we're rooting that in the proposition of a transcendent reality beyond the world that exists, a lawgiver. Islam also derives its worldview from the belief that Muhammad was, that God exists, but Islam derives its belief from the proposition that Muhammad was a prophet of God. So that's the root of Islamic belief. The core root, you can say, the Quran and the Hadith and all this stuff too, but the core proposition is that Muhammad was a prophet. That is what. And actually, incidentally, I didn't put this in my prepared notes for tonight, but that's why the antiquated term of Mohammedanism is actually a much more appropriate description of Islam than Islam, because Islam, does anybody know? I know some people here know what Islam means. Yeah? Submission, yeah. So Muslims, and Muslim means submitted, Muslims believe that they are submitted and they're submitted to God. Well, anybody who follows God, you would say that you're submitted to God. So that's sort of a step further, but I think it's a much more accurate descriptor actually to use. Although Mohammedanism is actually a mouthful to say, so we'll have to find a better solution for that at some point. But my argument tonight is that Islam's efforts to restrict speech, expression, and conscience via hate speech, hate crime, legislation, use of the terms Islamophobia, and incitement to religious hatred and these kind of things is not consciously on the part of all Muslims, but is consciously on the part of some Muslims, and certainly following the example of Muhammad is an attempt at colonization and conquering a new culture. And these are logical weapons of conquest. They're logical within the framework of Muhammad's life, which I'm going to go into in a second and tell you some of the examples from his life on which all these things rest. And they're weapons of conquest in the sense that this is the way that Muhammad used them. Rhetorically, he didn't only fight with weapons and horses and going into battle, but he also fought with words and with rhetoric and so forth. And it was a very key part of what he did. And it's long been something that I've been quite interested in, actually. All right, so we had recently who here was aware of the Muhammad cartoon contest? We've all seen that in Garland, Texas? Yeah. So a few years back, so we've had a number of things. Actually, I want to just take a moment before we continue on and talk about some of the incidents involving free speech in Islam in our cultural sphere of recent years. So one of them was the Draw Muhammad cartoon contest in Garland, Texas, which resulted in, perhaps predictably, a couple of Muslim guys showing up trying to kill everybody who was participating in this contest. It was organized by Pam Geller. Geert Wilders won the contest, and a number of other people participated. They had to hire their own security. And the ultimate result was the killing of the guys who had come out to kill all of them. What else? What else have we seen regarding free speech?
Dan, if I can,
Yes.
they can't be heard when they speak.
Oh, I'll repeat the okay.
No, but they can, see, we have mics.
Oh, you have a mic, okay, yeah.
At the end.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just discourage the interactive.
Oh, the interactive, okay, got it. Okay, so we've had, I'll give all the answers. You can interact in other ways.
You have a mic, if you want to make a longer comment.
Okay,
I have a question. It's
Yes.
Fundamental.
Could you wait, we have to
Yes.
speak in the mic.
Yeah, my name is Jack. And as a fundamental question, I was surprised that you got your dissertation correcting the Quran, when, as I understand it from Dr. Riley's book, they believe that's directly the word of God. So if it's changed,
yes,
it wouldn't come from God.
yeah,
I was a wonder that you're still walking.
yeah,
You know, that's,
yeah.
so I think it's interesting.
No, that's a very good question, and it was indeed a question that was in my mind when I began to go down this road, and and I think it's actually really helpful to what we're talking about as well. Patricia Crone, who Bob knows and a few of you know, she passed away recently, but was one of the really important scholars in our field, was speaking at Rice University, and this question came up when I was starting to think about my going down and pursuing this topic. And I was asked in her presence whether it would be safe to do this, and I turned to her and she said, no, it'll be fine. There's a certain space within for academics to do this kind of work, and also I think I'm asking questions of of artifacts and things that are there, and not coming to conclusions that are polemical in any sense. Other people can do that if they want to, and some people are doing that. But that to say, coming back to our point, it is an example of the diversity within Islam too. A lot of Muslims, particularly in the West, actually really do see the logic of the freedoms and the liberties that we have, admire them, and are in some cases really trying. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who I believe has also spoken here, are trying to reconcile these things with their faith in Islam. So I think we need to give space to folks to do. I mean, we all need to space. We're all on our individual journeys here, so to give space to people to explore and to think how they would do that. But I think we would do that as we have certain expectations within our culture, which I think is the main point tonight. So Geert Wilders, they've just recently announced another Draw Muhammad cartoon contest. And I want to come back to the logic of why they're doing that here in a minute, but he has been contacted by a lot of Muslims. Now, he's the one, again, who won the first contest, and he actually happens to be a former Muslim himself. And the interesting thing about, I'll just read you a small part of his comment here. He says, the one recurring word, he gets a lot of contact from Muslims about what he's doing. The one recurring word from the Muslims who wrote me, but who didn't threaten my life, was respect. And that I should respect Islam and not draw Muhammad. How about respect for me as an artist and my rights to express through my art what I think? I'm a former Muslim, and the most peaceful comment I've gotten from Muslims is that I will burn in hell if I don't return to Islam. Okay, and he says, no Muslims, not even those in the West, have written me to say, in essence, I may not like Muhammad cartoons, but I support your right to draw them.
Do you mean Bosch Fonson?
Bosch Foston, yeah.
You said your builders.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm reading Bosch Foston. Yeah. Okay, so we'll have to take that out. Yeah, I'm talking about Bosch Foston. Yeah, he's the cartoonist. Why did I get them mixed up? Okay, so what I just read was from Bosch Foston. Thank you, Clark. He says, no Muslims, not even those in the West, have written to me to say, in essence, I may not like Muhammad cartoons, but I support your right to draw them. If there's one issue that separates those who love freedom from everything else, it's free speech. Okay, so it's interesting because that is a core value that we kind of take for granted, and for many Muslims, it doesn't mean that no Muslim has been feeling that they would support him in that, but no Muslim has told them that. So I'm going to tell you the results of some polls here in a few minutes too that will underscore some of the diversity, but some of the alarming issues about the sentiments that we should pay attention to, I think. Okay. So non-Muslim populations the world over right now, that's maybe many of us, I don't know, we may have some Muslims in the room, but are being trained by Muslims, and not consciously or overtly, but I believe being trained, and you'll understand what I mean by this in a minute, to behave according to Islam's own definition of what that means. Okay, trained to behave. And I think that's the core point of these threats and the blasphemy laws and so forth. First, let's talk a little bit about the roots of liberty and justice for all. We did a bit. Okay, so when we talk about liberty and justice for all, we hold these truths to be self-evident. We've already said that. I've already mentioned that it's a biblical worldview. What does it contain? It contains the idea that truth exists, right? Secondly, it contains the idea that some truths are self-evident to those who look. Third, it's true that all people are created equal, according to that proposition. And all people have certain unalienable rights, and that these come from God, and that the partial list includes life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? So, and we certainly know that for the first 90 years of our nation's history, we had the pre-existing condition. By the way, it was a pre-existing condition of slavery. It was not something that was created by the founders or endorsed by the founders. It was something that was dealt with by the founders, and that they created in this document, they put in the document the seeds that would surely overcome it. So I think it's really, really important as we're in this state of, particularly with the millennials that we talked about, and other folks in our culture who have not really connected with our heritage as a country, that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, that we understand that the abolition of slavery, civil rights, all the liberties that have come in this country have come, through appeal to. Abraham Lincoln appealed to what? He appealed to the Declaration of Independence. Martin Luther King did. All these things have come as a result of that. So we don't say that medicine is bad because a doctor is a quack. We don't say that, whatever science is bad because some scientists tamper with the evidence. No, you chastise those scientists who are doing bad things, and then you work toward further fulfilling the ideals that you claim to be at the root of your endeavor. We don't say the FBI is rotten because a handful of people at the top, hypothetically speaking, happen to commit felonies using the power of the agency. You don't blame all the FBI by putting it. It would be crazy to put them all into retraining or anything like that, right? You would surely prosecute those folks who did that. So same thing. We have worked hard as a country and we've endured a lot to secure the freedoms that we have. We fought a costly civil war, which I think is still the most costly war in human lives in our nation's history. And so we have, and certainly, look at the achievements we've had as a country. We've been to the moon, at least according to most accounts. We've been to the moon. We've done, all the advancements in medicine and everything, so forth. And these are the results of the pursuit of truth. So it's something that we don't want to throw out too quickly. Okay, so I just want to throw this out there just to keep in your mind. When you're in contact sports, you usually wear some sort of protection or guard over your any areas that are more vulnerable, or if somebody goes to hit you, what do? You kind of cover your weakest places or what they're going to hit, right? So I'm not going to connect the dots there, but think about that as we move forward. The Soviet Union, when they were in existence, and I was just over there, as you know, it's bizarre. Red Square is actually, how many people here have been to Red Square? It's a lot smaller than I thought it would be. Did anybody else have that experience? Yeah. It wasn't tiny, but it was smaller than I thought. But the Soviet Union didn't erect the Berlin Wall because the propaganda was true. or because the amazing situation in their country was just so self-evident to everybody. They erected it because it was not true, and it was not, if they took down that wall, people weren't going to be flocking in, they were going to be flocking out. So bear that in mind as well. All right. So no human being has an inherent right to never be insulted or offended. That's a proposition I'm making. How could they? People all take offense at different things. And so I think when you saw the title of the talk tonight, you thought, this is crazy what's going on, many folks here, this is crazy what's going on around us in the world. How can you have the right not to be offended? I could be offended by anything. Anybody could, you would be able to say literally nothing in this world if every freedom, people were protected from every offense. So I think a lot of folks haven't taken that to its logical conclusion, but we really need to. Okay, so what do you get when you have freedom of speech? You have the possible malignment of truth. You have possible messiness, but you have at least the ability to pursue it. Okay. So in Islam, it is true that penalties against speech violations are selectively applied. So I want to read you one of these from the Pakistani Penal Code, which is pretty much in line with classical Islam in the sources. Section 295C, which was passed in 1986, so relatively recent, says this, in Urdu, I presume, but it says, whoever by words, either spoken or written, or by visible representation, or by any imputation, innuendo, or insinuation, directly or indirectly, defiles the sacred name of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, and they say peace be upon him, shall be punished with death or imprisonment for life, and shall also be liable to fine. So where does that come from? It comes from Sharia, and actually, Sharia is a name that is given to something that actually doesn't really exist in a single whole. It's a word that's given to something. It means actually it comes from the same word for one of the two words for street or road. Shara, it's the path. It's like the straight path that you're supposed to walk in. All right, Sharia means the straight path, and so it is formulated out of. It's a legal formulation that comes out of the Quran, comes out of the example of Muhammad as a prophet, comes out of the Hadith, which are the collections of the things that he said and did, approved of, disapproved of, what his followers approved of or disapproved of, what he allowed to be done in his presence, and so forth. It comes from to a certain extent, the commentaries. It comes from the historical texts, and comes from the biography, if I didn't mention that already, of his life. So Sharia is this conglomeration of stuff, and there are different schools of law in Islam. There are 5 major ones, 4, and then a 5th one these disagree on some points, but they do agree on the major points. And the major points include, for example, the fact that you are not to malign the Prophet or malign Islam. So I'm not going to go through all those things tonight, but what I am going to do is I'm going to go back to the biography of Muhammad and read you a couple of examples from his life that these things all can be traced back to. And when you look at folks like Ibn Taymiyyah and others who are tremendously popular in this area, this is what they're basing their example. They're basing their decisions upon the example of Muhammad himself. So if you are interested in knowing about the actual book, there are probably hundreds, maybe thousands of biographies of Muhammad. This is the translation in English of the earliest one that we have. It's translated by, it was written by Ibn Hisham. It was a revision of it was made by, it was written by Ibn Ishaq. The revision was made by Ibn Hisham. And it's a couple hundred years after Muhammad's death, but it's the earliest source that we have to his life. Okay? So how did Muhammad deal with insults? I actually, a number of years ago, made my own handy list as I went through this of all the different, topical list of the different things, and I noticed how Muhammad handled criticism. And I'm not going to read you all of them, but a few key ones will serve the purpose of understanding this. Okay. So in the earlier time in Muhammad's life, he lived in Mecca. According to the tradition, he lived in Mecca, and then he was very weak. He was an orphan. He needed protection of his family and so forth. And at one point he had to, after he met the angel and realized and was told by his wife that he was a prophet and started to get more revelations, and his community started to grow. He had more power with more people behind him. And so they migrated up to Medina, and so the Quran is divided into sections that are Meccan or Medinan, and the earlier sections tend to be a little bit more peaceful, and the later sections, the Medinan period of his life, was more violent, and this is just the way the history of his life went, and so the Quran reflects that as well. So there are examples of times in his life when he was patient in the face of criticism, and they were all in those earlier Meccan, for the most part, in the early Meccan period. People would make insults toward him, and the worst he would respond with he would either show forbearance or he would make a veiled threat to them. For example, in this one case, while they were discussing with him, the apostle came towards them and kissed the black stone. This is on the Kaaba. Then he passed them as he walked around the temple. As he passed by, they said some injurious things about him. This I could see from his expression. He went on, and as he passed them a second time, they attacked him similarly. This I could see from his expression. Then he passed the third time, and they did the same. He stopped and said, "Will you listen to me, O Quraysh? By him who holds my life in his hand, I bring you slaughter." Again, at this time, this is all he said is the threat of slaughter. So that was the first kind of indication of anything violent that I noticed in there. Well, it becomes a little bit more strong later on. A man of Aslam who had a good memory told me that Abu Jahl passed by the apostle at Safa, insulted him, and behaved most offensively. So this guy Hamza, who was a follower of Muhammad, went over and to this guy who had insulted Muhammad and started beating him over the head. And without reading the entire quote there, the biography says that Hamza's Islam was complete, and he followed the apostles' commands of what he had done there. There was a situation in which Gabriel himself, the angel, came down and actually killed 5 people who had insulted Muhammad. That wasn't him actually acting. One of the more well-known ones is that Muhammad was being ridiculed by a man, and he had 2 singing girls who composed poetry that were mocking of the Muslim women. And Muhammad said to one of the folks who was near him, Abdullah bin al-Mughith, he said, "Who will rid me of Ibn al-Ashraf?" This is the guy who had made fun of him. And one of the guys said, "I'll deal with him for you, O apostle of God, I will kill him." He said, "Do so if you can." And the guy said, "Well, I'm going to have to, in order to get close to him, I'm going to have to tell lies." And Muhammad said, "Well, okay, go ahead and tell lies." And so he did. And again, to make a long story short, he goes out and assassinates the guy and his 2 singing girls. And there are a couple of other instances like that. So, without reading you all those, I want you to understand that this is it's the insulting of Muhammad and how he dealt with insults that forms the example after which Muslims today, whether they realize it or not, it's become so much a part of the culture that a lot of I've yet to meet any Muslim person who's actually read this. Usually, people will read a more modern version of the biography. This is a little bit raw. I mean, if you read it, it's hard for anybody to go through it and not think there's something pretty violent in some cases here. So most Muslims will not have interacted with this, but they have inherited through the schools of law and so forth the idea that Muhammad needs to be defended and with violence, and his honor needs to be defended with violence. So what's going on here? This is the meat of what we'll be talking about. This is the source where it comes from. Number two, you have an issue of a cultural value, and that cultural value is honor and shame. And most Muslims, and not only Islamic culture, but many Eastern cultures, deal on a paradigm of reality that operates much more on this continuum of honor and shame. So when something's not right with the world, you want to restore the honor of the situation rather than, in our case, in American culture tends to operate on this truth versus falsehood continuum. So truth is the most important thing, or at least at one time it was in our culture. But there's still this idea that truth is the highest thing to be pursued above all else. And that's a very foreign concept to many people who are inside Islam. And I say many because I don't want to generalize everybody. There's all kinds of different people within this. So you've got these two. You've got the honor shame, and you've got the sources. And there are a couple verses in the Quran too, which the commentators have almost entirely interpret to mean punishment in this world that should be administered at the hands of Muslims, if anyone, not just a Muslim, but if anybody insults Muhammad or insults the Quran. Okay, there was a survey taken a couple of years ago in 2015, and this should be interesting. It was taken within the United States of Muslims who are currently living in the United States. There's a diversity of opinions on some of these things, but I want to highlight some of them for you, and then we'll conclude with a couple of comments about these things. First, I identified that they were Muslims and they were indeed living in the United States, and then they asked a series of questions, and among the questions were, if Sharia conflicts with the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which law should be considered supreme? If Sharia conflicts with the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which law should be considered supreme? Thankfully, 43% of the respondents said the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights should be supreme. 33% said Sharia should be supreme if it conflicts. 17% said they didn't know, and 8% didn't answer. Another question said, should Muslims in the U.S. have their own courts or tribunals in America to apply Sharia law, or should they be subject to American laws and courts? 39% of the respondents said American courts only. One law for everybody in the country. 36% said they should be free to choose either, and 15% said Sharia courts only. Now notice that when they said be free to choose either, what is really being said there? What's really being said there? If I don't like the laws of the United States in any given situation, I should be free to not be bound by them, but to be judged by another law. So you combine those two together, and you have 51% of those respondents who felt that way. Another question was, quote, whether you agree or disagree with the statement. I believe that violence against those that insult the Prophet Muhammad, the Quran, or Islamic faith is sometimes acceptable. 29% agreed, some strongly agreed and some somewhat agreed, and 61% disagreed that violence is sometimes acceptable in that situation. Next, another question was, violence against Americans here in the United States can be justified as part of the global jihad. 25% agreed that it could be sometimes justified, and 64% disagreed. Do you think the use of violence in the United States is justified in order to make Sharia the law of the land of this country? 19% said yes, 66% said no, and 11% said they don't know. All right, so there were further questions, and some of these would be American citizens, and obviously if you're an American citizen, you have, there's the diversity of opinion, and this is the freedom of speech involves the freedom to believe and freedom of conscience to follow these different ways. It ends, obviously, at the end of another person's nose. You don't have the right to lay a hand on another person, which is something that we seem to have lost in our nation as well. But I want to bring this to a conclusion, and sadly, I wish I could have covered more examples here. Sorry, excuse me a moment. So, we actually haven't talked about the issue of about the question of Islamophobia and all these things too. So, what are these trying to accomplish? The speech limitations and the speech codes. So we know that they exist here. We know they exist in Islamic culture. What was Muhammad doing with them? Well, think of the effect. Well, the effect in his life was that people stopped openly questioning him, and it gave the impression that he was a true prophet of God. And eventually people came into Islam, and he was obviously very successful in his conquest and his expansion and so forth. So that was the logic of what he was doing in his time. And so, consciously or not, you have what you have happening when you have fear of Islamophobia. What is Islamophobia? It's a word that none of us wants to be labeled with, right? Nobody wants to be labeled with the word Islamophobia, or being called an Islamophobe. And that's the intention of the word. It's to label you, to create a label that you, in fear, will self-censor your speech. You will not say things, you'll treat with kid gloves one particular subject, whereas you may speak quite openly and quite frankly and quite critically of anything else. You're going to refrain from criticism in one particular area. I don't want to overplay the intentionality of the, when I say it's a tool of conquest, right? I don't want to overplay the intentionality. I, by no means, believe that all, or even most Muslims in our country have this intention of doing this. But it is the effect of it, and it is the intention of some groups like CARE and the Muslim Brotherhood and others, I believe, to create these terms and to hammer them home. Islamophobia, hate speech, hate crime legislation. Why should a crime be any worse if it's motivated by one thing versus another? I mean, if you kill somebody, it should be wrong to do that regardless of the case. Well, the reason that you have being used is because it takes the guilt away from the person who's actually doing the act, and it sort of puts it on everybody who may have this sort of feeling in their heart, even if they would never commit a crime or would never. It places the guilt on more broadly across society. It also makes it just a generally bad thing to have a feeling in your heart of being critical of that particular group. So it's really nice for when you're going into conquest to have the resources and the ability and the strength and the troops to be able to go and breach those walls and to get in there and to conquer. If you don't have those, it's actually kind of nice if you could somehow persuade the people that you're trying to conquer to dismantle their defenses with their own hands. And so I would just propose for your thought this evening that is one of the things that's being done here with this. And so the question becomes, what then should we do in this case? Number one, I would want to say something that we should not do. We should not treat any people as if they are not human or not fully worthy of all the rights and privileges of what we say we believe, which is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, liberty and justice for all, and so forth. We should also not, obviously, it's horrible that I should even have to say it, but we should not prejudge groups of people or even make assumptions about what somebody might believe, because a lot of people are kind of on a way to, they may have different assumptions from what we might think. Okay, but the first thing I propose that we should do is understand the reason for all of these calls for limitations on speech, the use of the word Islamophobia. To me, when somebody uses the term Islamophobia, it's a sign either of low intelligence or of some ulterior motive that is really not good. So I think this is a very informed group of people, but to use language very intentionally. Avoid using these kind of terms that are not helpful and that really are actually harmful to free discourse in our country. And then work to preserve free speech. Folks like Robert Spencer, Geert Wilders, this time, Bosch Faustin, Pam Geller, and others who are doing these kind of things. I mean, I don't know what's in their hearts when they're doing the Draw Muhammad contest and so forth, but understand what it is that they are doing. It's not really about provoking. What they're doing is they're carving out space for liberty and for free speech in this country. That's a really important function. They're doing it to a certain, with the great risk to themselves. But if you've ever been, my daughter just went out in our yard, in our garden, and we had this space where I carve out down by the stream in our property where I would go down and study and read books all day long and stuff like that. But I haven't been down there in about a year, and the stuff is all kind of overgrown. And she said, Dad, I can't even get in there anymore. And it's amazing what can happen. You know, it's the same thing with liberty. If we don't continually, zealously guard the space for free expression and free speech, it will be encroached upon, and it will disappear. All right, and then third, when it comes to the president, for example, or elected officials, we need to think before speaking. If the knee-jerk, just one thing that came to my mind that happened recently is the limitation on immigration that he put from certain countries, which it was a lot of people who even defended him from the accusation of having done a Muslim ban went out and said it's not a Muslim ban, which actually it wasn't. But I don't think that was the best way of answering that question, right? The statute actually, as some of you I'm sure know, the president had plenary authority to make limitations on immigration based on anything that he thought was relevant to the national security of the country. That's one of the particular powers of the presidency that he had. So, hypothetically speaking, if he had done a Muslim ban, which he didn't, it would have been legal for him to do that. So, and I don't think it would have been wise for him to do that. But when we answer these things, I think it's important to speak clearly and raise the question. That I think a more productive way of answering that would have been, well, it wasn't a Muslim ban, but since you raised the subject, maybe we have these results of these polls here. If somebody's wanting to come into this country, how about asking some of these questions? Do you think that in a situation where Sharia conflicts with the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights, which do you think should take precedence? Right? If somebody answers that Sharia should take precedence, there's no right to immigrate to the United States. So why are we in this situation right now where we're even having to have this conversation about free speech? We have a lot of people in this country. We used to ask these kind of questions about communism and the other, Islam and communism actually have a similar, again, not all the people, but the political ideology have a similar totalitarian mindset. So we need to start thinking again, in my view, about asking these kind of questions and welcoming people who want to come to the United States and join the melting pot and blend in, and who admire and appreciate the values, the principles, the moral base of our culture, and saying to other folks, no thanks. Try again when you're willing to come and be live as a good neighbor alongside everybody else. I'm going to end there. Thank you very much for being here tonight, and I will take questions. Is that right? Okay.
In your survey of the 5 different schools of Islamic speak, have you found that all 5 schools put an equal score or different score by the doctrine of nasikh abrogation in determining Sharia law? Nasikh is I'm not going to speak out of full knowledge here because I'm not a fiqh expert, actually. Nasikh is a fairly well accepted, it is a universally accepted principle, but I'm not sure between the schools of law how it plays out and what the particularities of that are. And somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I think nasikh is, the doctrine of abrogation is fairly established among the schools of law. You've done some reading in that, I believe, as well, right?
Not on that specific.
Yeah. Just to make clear what the question was, there is a principle. So when I talked about the earlier and later stages of Muhammad's life, the reason this question is relevant is that you have to know which one of those has authority for law. And the way you decide that, the way that the Muslim jurists have come settled upon to decide that, is that if the Quran disagrees with itself, the Quran can cancel itself out. And, by the way, the Quran can cancel out earlier revelations. So if the Quran, for example, disagrees with the Bible or something like that, it would cancel out anything at any point at which it disagrees. In other words, God has the prerogative to cancel earlier revelations. Is that a fair description from what you know as well? So that was the nature of that question. Yes.
My name is Jack Pagano. I run a TV network in Afghanistan. Been here since 2007.
Okay.
64 million viewers, mostly Pashto, on the border of Pakistan and of course the tribal regions of Afghanistan. This one question I want to ask you is about the Quran. 5 years ago in September, Pastor Terry Jones,
Yeah.
to burn 3,000 Qurans. And now I've been back and forth to Afghanistan. That's the one question they always ask. When is Terry Jones going to burn some more Qurans? They view the Quran as their sacred honor, and they always ask me the question, when is he going to do it again? And I can tell him he's in jail, he'll never do it. But it's one of those unique questions. They don't ask me about other opportunities, they ask me about that incident, and it just sort of never comes. What's your effect on that?
Well, what's your impression of why they're asking you that question?
They're interested to find out if all Americans are like Terry Jones. So I explain
Yeah.
to them that he's one person.
Yeah.
Millions of Americans are thousands.
Right. Yeah. So it's certainly one of the most severe cultural disconnects there as to why any country would allow something like that to happen. It is very, very important that we preserve the space for people to do that. I mean, he bought the Quran; it was his Quran to do that, I presume. It wasn't somebody else's Quran. But so many people around the world, and even in other Western countries, do not understand why there should be the liberty to do something like that in a country like the United States. And even many Americans don't understand why there should be the liberty to do that. And again, I'm not a provocative person, and I wouldn't do something like that myself. But there is, again, the way I view that is continuing to carve out that space. I don't know if there's a way to help some Pashtun folks in Afghanistan understand or even begin to understand that. That's maybe the rhetorical challenge of our time. We may not be able to do that, but I understand it. And is that the best rhetorical strategy? I don't know, but it's something that you can do in the United States of America, and then hopefully the space will remain to do things like that as well. Again, not to be provocative. Any other question? Anybody have a question or comment on that too? Feel free.
You mentioned the blasphemy laws, and I'm curious if you've studied those very much. But the question is, have you found any blasphemy laws that are kind of across the board fair, or are all the ones that you've seen kind of one-sided? You can't blaspheme Muhammad or the Quran, but have you found any that are more general and balanced?
Yeah, no, if I understand your question correctly, this is a very good question. The laws are all focused upon Muhammad, protecting Muhammad and protecting the Quran. Protecting God, but I do know that some of the legal opinions, as I've been preparing for tonight, don't place such a great emphasis on blasphemy against God, because the view in that particular case was that God could protect himself, but Muhammad is no longer able to, since he's not living. But to go beyond that, the Quran insults Jesus, for example. I mean, what bigger insult could you give than to say that God is only a man, from a Christian point of view, and if we're talking about points of view, which we are. So there's a preservation of the ability to insult, and
the space is conceptualized within Islamic law as according to Islam's view. So if anybody's ever had conversations with Muslims, and I have many times, and wonderful people, and some great conversations, and even sometimes folks love to talk even about these things, really getting down to the heart of the matter. But it will be said that, we to be good Muslims, we have to respect Jesus. We have to respect the prophets and Abraham and David. And we can't be good Muslims if we don't do that. But what they're meaning by that is that we have to respect them according to what the Quran says about them, not according to what the Bible says about them or anything else. So no, there's no protection against, there's no punishment for blasphemy against Jesus by saying he's not God. In fact, if there were, then the Quran would be in trouble. One over here, and then, yes.
I just asked a question. I've read the Noble Quran from beginning to the end, and it scared me quite a bit. And my question is, are all, and that's a Wahhabi Sunni type from Saudi Arabia.
The Noble Quran,
that
yeah.
interpretation.
Muslim
Are all Qurans that strongly against unbelievers? And then I asked the question, if this is the most common Quran used in American schools or American Islamic schools, now children are being raised with those thoughts, is that something that I should be fearful of as they grow up with these ideas against unbelievers? And so I think it's freedom of conscience does not exist in the Quranic thought pattern. So are all Qurans that strongly worded?
You mean that in the so what you read was a translation, and I have that one on my shelf among many others, and there are some others that are fairly popular in the United States as well, including some of the ones that are not so popular. There's a feminist translation. There are a number of other sort of mainline popular translations and so forth. This one is a little bit stilted and awkward, but actually I'm familiar with that translation, and it's fairly faithful to, as you can imagine, with any translation work, that you can be more literal or you can be more figurative, or you can sometimes take liberties with the meanings and so forth, or even for an English-speaking audience, you can smooth things out a little bit from what. But I think that's, actually I don't use that translation much, but I haven't found any particular problem with it. My favorite translation is this one here. It's Majid Fakhri. And so there are two, actually. There's one by Arthur Droge, which is recently out, was more academic, and it's pretty good too. But I found this one to be very literal. I'm comparing the Arabic to the English. But in answer to your question, it's the stuff that's in there that you saw is there. That's just the fact of the matter. And
Can the children be brainwashed in that respect?
well, it's a
Taught to respect the Quran, and
Yeah.
and take it literally and kind of internalize that as they grow up.
yeah. If it's the question is if it's revelation from God, then then that's true, and Muslims believe that that's true. So that's going to be what will be informing their worldview. Sometimes in Arabic, but actually most Muslims in the world don't read or understand Arabic. I had as part of my work at Rice, I was teaching Arabic to other to graduate students, and one guy had won the Tajweed contest at his local mosque, which is the reading, the recitation with the intonation and so forth, and he won the top honor in that. So we read a verse, and I said, okay, now what does it mean? He didn't know what it meant. So the importance is actually for reading, the merit, the benefit of the work is actually in the reading and the recitation and doing the prayers and so forth. It isn't really in the understanding. So maybe it's good in some cases that some folks don't work that hard to understand it. I don't know, but yes.
Can you talk a little bit about your forthcoming books?
Sure.
That are about to come out?
Yeah. I've been very slow to get my monograph out, but it has, and in the meantime, my research is growing. So we've got about 4,000 corrections now that I'm working with. So trying to keep those all funneled into a book and index them appropriately and get the photographs all permissioned and all that kind of stuff is the big challenge there.
But that's what that's going to be, discussion of the corrections in their whole body of them. And then I have a smaller one that is going to be 20 examples of corrections in Quran manuscripts, where I pick out 20 of my favorites, just as to give a feeling for people of what's going on in these manuscripts. And the third one is just introduction to corrections in Quran manuscripts. It's somewhere in between those two. And I'm also working on a political book, which should be out in the next month or so. So pretty busy. Okay. Yes, thank you.
I'm Charles Mills. Well, I agree with all your conclusions, and that's an excellent call. I don't believe that your understanding of the Declaration of Independence is
Okay.
supported by historical continuity.
Okay.
We have two particularly egregious examples.
About men, yeah?
Yeah, about, and both of these are from the late 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is the Supreme Court upheld a requirement of an oath that you didn't believe in plural marriage over the vote in Utah.
Uh-huh.
And another one was in the late 19th century. We took the children of Indians, American Indians, put them in boarding schools so they wouldn't learn Indian religion. So these are just two examples, and I could find many, many more like this,
Yeah.
which the understanding of the Declaration of Independence and the First Amendment does not have the historical continuity that makes our 20th century understanding continuous from the original.
And the first one was on the plural marriage. 'Cause I'm not familiar with that one, but I know that that was going on in Utah. But what was the nature of that?
Well, there were 5 Supreme Court polygamy cases.
Okay.
And one of them, they upheld an oath that in order to vote, that you did not believe in polygamy. You wanted to vote.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And then the Indian
Yeah.
schools, another. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, explicitly believed in freedom of religion for Muslims and Hindus.
Yeah.
But he apparently did not believe in freedom of religion for American Indians.
Yeah. Well, and I think my point, and I don't disagree with you on that, but I think my point was that there was a variety of belief among the various signers of the Declaration, but I think the principle was laid down there in general form. Well, maybe we can't be too firm on that, but I believe that it was a general principle that we took quite a bit of time to live up to. And by the way, there have been more than one Supreme Court decision that has been far afoul of the Constitution in our history, and a couple, have been overturned and so forth. So yes, I'm sorry, I don't know who was next, but yeah.
Among the manuscripts that you looked at,
Yes.
the revisions, were you able to determine or hypothesize about who made those corrections, when they were made?
Yeah.
And also, we've spoken with senior jurists in Islam now to decide whether or not they accept them. Can you repeat the question?
So the question was, have I been able to discern by whom corrections were made in my work with manuscripts, when they were made, and then thirdly, have I spoken with modern jurists to see whether they accept the corrections? I'll answer the third one first, and that is that the corrections in almost every case bring the manuscripts closer to the way the Quran is today. So that seems to be the trend, that you had some manuscripts that were at variance, and they were at some point in time brought toward, not entirely into conformity, but toward conformity with what we have today. And so I don't think there would be any dispute with the current form of those manuscripts. Well, there might be, because some of them are still out of conformity in various ways. The way that would be answered without boring everybody to death would be that there was a feeling that the Quran was transmitted orally, primarily, and that secondarily it was written down in manuscripts. And so manuscripts have not been given a lot of attention for a long period of time because it's been felt that they're just not that important. They weren't the primary means of transmission. So I think it's not entirely correct, because if oral transmission was so dominant, then why would not all the manuscripts be perfectly aligned? Because everybody had it memorized and they would write it down and it would be, the same thing. But at any rate, and then thirdly, I don't think there's been the full extent of interaction with the work with the manuscripts yet, and so these questions might come up. And then lastly, about who made the corrections and when, yes, sometimes you can see that the nib and the writing style and dimension of what's been written that's new is quite different. And sometimes you can see that it looks like it was the original scribe, so maybe they made a mistake as they were going along, and then they erased it after the ink had dried and wrote it over again the right way. And so those are the kind of judgments we have to make when we're looking at these things. Short answer. Yes.
Previously, you mentioned that we should check immigrants who come in to see if, coming into this country, see if they go along with Sharia law. But on the other hand, if they lie, if they really,
Yeah.
for instance, if they lie to Muhammad, if they can do that, it seems difficult. It'd be difficult for anybody.
Yeah.
Not even going into court, where they put their hand in the Bible, they don't believe the Bible.
Yeah.
They put their hand in the Quran, and they say, come on. So, you're putting around the dark.
I think these are questions that need to be wrestled with, and I don't know the exact way of doing policy, but I think it's fair to at least ask the questions, and perhaps, I mean, a lot of people are on social media these days too. Not to say that you're looking to anybody's social media, but if it comes to your attention that somebody has made some subversive comment or sympathy to a radical group, I don't know. Actually, I'm not proposing that. I'm thinking out loud, but I don't think you're going to have a perfect system, but I think you can have a better system than the one that we have, which is just come on in. As far as I understand it, maybe it's not that way. So.
Yeah, I have sort of two questions or points of discussion. I think that we're governed by the Constitution and the laws and principles of the Declaration of Independence as a given. So why are we even asking the question?
Yeah.
Sampling of 4% of the population, whether they support the Sharia or not. I mean, might go back.
Yeah, well, you would think that. Yeah.
There are other small number of people.
Yeah.
That's one thought.
You've seen
the
that?
other thought is, I wanted to raise with you your opening remarks. Your opening remarks, you spoke about free speech.
Yeah.
And of course, for free speech is somewhat limited. There's the classic example, you're not free to yell fire in a theater. But there's a difference between an anonymous speech or personal attacks and discussion of ideas. In your work, there's a discussion of ideas. But if you had used your work to insult Islam, I'm sure you would have received a lot of negative response.
Yeah.
We're free to insult one another. We hear a lot of it these days.
Yeah.
But it only, and how attacks are not logical and they're emotional. And at least in my mind, they should be avoided.
And there's a question of should be avoided. I would agree with that generally with some of my interactions on social media, which Claire has been able to witness as well too. A lot of people descend into ad hominem a lot, and it's not helpful. But the ability to interact with the problem is that when you with some of the things that we're doing that you would be saying that could be factual could be taken as an insult in relation to these subjects. And so I think it's just better to err on the side of preserving that ability, obviously screaming foul. The tendency is to try to blame the victim. So if you compare insulting Muhammad or saying whatever it is about him, whether it's based in the history or not, to inciting to religious hatred, is that you've now found a way to blame the victim. If somebody attacks you, oh well, it's what you said that made me kill you. Well, okay, but I just said something and you killed me. But those are disproportional. So I worked in human resources for a while, and one of the things that we did there is that, obviously we need to wind this up, don't we?
Just one more question.
Okay. We need to. So
I basically want to repeat the last point that was made. I appreciate the fact that you advised us against using certain words like homophobia and some other things, and advised us to defend free speech.
Yeah.
Those are not contradictory, and it's important to recognize that they're not contradictory.
Thank you.
What we should be allowed to do is different from what good manners or good judgment lead us to do.
Yeah, and it's also a shaping of the moral character of our culture, which is lacking. So when you use language precisely and productively, not everybody's going to do it, but if you, as a single person, choose to speak in ways that are helpful, it can help move things along. And that's a choice that every individual person has to make.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you very much.